The banquet hall reeked of warm brass fixtures, furniture wax, and that sharp lemon-scented cleaner hotel spray around when they want a space to feel pricier than it actually is. My brother Gary stood under a golden spotlight, grinning at 400 guests while he explained to them why I'd never made anything of myself. One hand rested on the lectern, the other pointed toward the massive screen behind him, where his own portrait hung, frozen next to an artist's rendering of the new Hartsville Veterans Memorial. His name was etched into the base in letters big enough to spot from the highway. "My sister Maggie served too," he announced, locating me at table 31, tucked near the kitchen entrance. 24 years, technically speaking. Close enough to the choppers to breathe in the fuel fumes, but never quite skilled enough to actually pilot one. The crowd offered up the easy chuckle people give a well-regarded man when they assume whoever he's mocking has it coming. I rested my damaged left hand flat against the tablecloth. My final 2 fingers refused to lie straight. They hadn't straightened in 15 years. Tucked inside my purse, beneath my coat check stub, sat a sealed Department of the Army envelope I'd carried into that room without fully understanding why. I discovered it that morning inside a rusted metal box pulled from my father's old shed. My name was scrawled across the front in my mother's cursive. I hadn't broken the seal yet. Gary leaned in toward the mic. She came home with a busted hand, a modest little house, and no family to speak of. I always tell her, somebody's got to carry the Sutton name forward. The laughter swelled louder this time. That's when the retired 3-star general seated at the front table rose to his feet. His chair scraped back only about 6 inches, but every service member in that ballroom clocked it instantly. The firefighters stopped their side conversations. The color guard froze in place. Even the young journalist at my table set down his pen. Gary kept right on smiling, oblivious to what that silver-haired man's lapel pin actually signified. I wasn't. The general's gaze swept past the stage, past the wealthy donors, past the town council members, all the way back to the least desirable table in the room. Then a firefighter in full dress uniform shot up so abruptly, his chair toppled backward. The crack of wood hitting the ballroom floor echoed like gunfire. Gary had no clue what he'd just triggered. My name is Margaret Sutton. Most folks know me as Maggie. I was 60 that night, and for 40 years, I'd let my own family believe a lie because the truth was tangled up with the worst night of my life. That lie took root in Hartsville, Kentucky, a town small enough that everyone knows which church pew you abandoned, yet big enough to pretend nobody gossips about the reasons why. I was raised in a white farmhouse behind my father's repair garage. Come summer, the kitchen curtains filtered the sunlight into a pale gold. My mother, Eleanor, kept a sprig of lavender in a chipped jar by the sink. My father, Ray, kept his silence tucked into every corner of the house. He'd returned from Vietnam before I was even born and never once spoke of it. He taught Gary and me that useful people worked, that weak people made excuses, and that respectable people never fished for compliments. Gary absorbed the parts of that lesson that made him boisterous. I absorbed the parts that taught me to fade into the background. At 12, I built a model helicopter out of scrap lumber for the county science fair. The rotor assembly genuinely pivoted. My mother stayed up late helping me paint the body army green while my father sat in the next room watching TV. I took first place. At the dinner table that night, Gary knocked his milk glass over, splattering my certificate. Dad just laughed and said, "Well, now it actually looks fit for a garage wall." My mother cleaned it up quietly after everyone had gone to bed. The paper dried, warped. She pressed it flat between 2 cookbooks and told me, "Some things still soar even after they've bent." When Gary made the varsity football squad, my father shut the garage down early and hung a banner across the porch. When I received my acceptance into Army flight training, he read the letter at the kitchen table, folded it once, and muttered, "They're loosening the standards everywhere these days." My mother reached under the table and squeezed my wrist. That was her way of showing love. Quietly, in the spaces my father couldn't see. I left Hartsville at 20 because staying felt like a slow, polite drowning. I didn't leave chasing glory. I left because the Army was the first place that judged me by what I could do once the engine failed, not by how it made my father feel to watch me succeed. Flight school smelled of sun-scorched asphalt, hydraulic oil, and sweat soaked into a helmet liner. I wasn't the toughest candidate there, or the loudest. I was the one who double-checked everything and panicked dead last. The first instructor who truly got me was Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Reyes. He watched me pull out of a simulated tail rotor failure while 2 classmates locked up completely. After we touched down, he climbed out, shut the door, and told me, "Sutton, you don't fight the aircraft. You listen until it tells you how it wants to survive." I carried that line with me through 2 wars. I flew medevac, dust-off runs. We went wherever wounded soldiers waited under fire, and time collapsed down to fuel levels, distance, blood pressure, and weather conditions. My call sign was Halo 6. I never once announced it. I never had to. During one deployment, a roadside bomb tore apart a convoy outside Kandahar. Dust turned the sky the color of rust. We touched down beside a burning vehicle while rounds struck the dirt near our skids. A medic hauled a boy toward us, half his uniform scorched black. He was 19. He kept asking if his legs were still attached. I glanced over my shoulder and told him, "Hold your altitude." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Pick a fixed point," I said. "Stay locked on it until we get you home." He did. Years later, on the 4th of March, a storm sealed off a mountain valley like a closed fist. A platoon got pinned below a ridge, taking fire from 3 directions at once. Command ordered every aircraft grounded. The ceiling sat below minimums. The approach was completely exposed. On paper, the call was correct. 11 men were going to die by the book. Reyes was my operations officer by then. He stood beside the map as radio chatter dissolved into gunfire and clipped grid coordinates. He never gave me an order to fly. He just looked at me and said, "You heard them." I nodded. Everything that followed happened in a blur and lingered in my mind slowly ever since. Rain hammered the windshield sideways. The valley lit up with muzzle flashes. We dropped in low enough to clip branches off the trees. The crew chief shouted out distances. The medic loaded 5 wounded onto the first run. We pulled out with rounds punching straight through the tail boom. Then we went back. No debate, no pause, no hesitation. On the second run, we took a hit crossing the far ridge. The aircraft slammed downward hard. My left hand smashed into the collective housing. 2 fingers shattered in ways that never fully healed. I remember smoke, wet earth, someone dragging me through a torn open door. I remember the youngest soldier clutching my hand, sobbing that he couldn't feel his legs. "Hold your altitude," I told him again. We all survived. 11 soldiers, 4 crew members, 1 aircraft wrecked beyond salvage. The Army handed me a Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation went into a black case. I shoved it into a closet and went back to work. That same year, my mother passed away. I missed her final lucid day because I was busy evacuating casualties after another strike. Gary told me afterward that she'd asked for me twice. My father never said whether he'd answered her. I came home months later with my hand in a brace, shrapnel still lodged beneath my uniform sleeves. I drove straight to the repair garage, determined to finally tell Dad everything. He was sanding down a table leg in the shed, the air thick with sawdust and gasoline fumes. I told him there'd been a rough mission. I told him men had been trapped. I told him I'd flown when every aircraft had been ordered grounded. He stopped sanding. "We don't go on about ourselves in this family," he said. "I'm not going on," I told him. "The real ones come home and stay quiet," he said. He never turned to face me. I understood years later that he was really talking about his own war. His silence wasn't wisdom. It was a bunker he'd built inside himself, and my truth threatened to crack its walls. But I was still his daughter. I still wanted a single sentence of acknowledgement from him. So instead I said, "You're right, Dad." That was the moment I quit waiting for his approval. A month afterward, I overheard him telling a neighbor that I'd washed out of flight duty and gotten shuffled behind a desk. He claimed my ruined hand came from some maintenance mishap. I stood behind the screen door and let him finish. Silence can masquerade as mercy the first time you choose it. Given enough years, it turns into evidence stacked against you. Gary built his entire life on top of that evidence. He stayed put in Hartsville, took over the repair shop, sold it off, and opened a used car lot, then 2 more after that. His face ended up on billboards. He sponsored football games, charity auctions, 4th of July fireworks displays. He never served a day, but he mastered the art of standing next to people who had and letting the cameras decide what that implied. When our father died, Gary donated enough money to finish the town's Veterans Memorial. The committee crowned him Hartsville's Citizen Patriot of the Year. The gala invitation showed up in a cream envelope stamped with gold lettering. His wife, Tara, phoned me 2 days later. "We seated you at table 31, she said. "It's toward the back so you won't feel overwhelmed by all the important guests." "I understand," I told her. "Gary worries about you out there alone in that little house," she added. "He says somebody's got to keep carrying the family name." She let out a soft laugh, dressed up to sound kind. I nearly stayed home. The morning of the gala, I went out to my father's old shed hunting for a wrench. Nobody had touched the place since his death. Cold tools still hung above the workbench. Dust coated everything except one small, rusted ammunition box wedged behind a crate. Its lock had already been snapped. Inside were my mother's recipe cards, 3 photographs from my flight school days, a newspaper clipping about a medevac award ceremony I'd never actually attended, and a sealed government envelope. Margaret, my mother had written across the front. Beneath my name, 4 smaller words, "When you're ready." I carried it into the gala unopened. By the time Gary reached the microphone, I'd already sat through Tara's remarks about my plain outfit, a slideshow that gave disabled veterans 2 seconds of screen time each, and Gary a full 10, and a seating chart that placed the town's actual service members behind the men who'd funded the memorial. I noticed every bit of it. That's another habit the Army leaves you with. Count the exits. Count the hands. Count the gap between what people claim and what they're actually doing. 14 servers, 3 kitchen doors, 2 uniformed officers near the stage, 1 retired general whose name I recognized instantly from the program. Lieutenant General Thomas Rourke had commanded the very division whose platoon had gotten trapped on the 4th of March. He had no idea I was in the room. We'd never met. Gary's first jab landed before dinner when he introduced me to a county commissioner. "My sister handled paperwork for Army Aviation," he said. "She likes to say she was close to the action." I looked the commissioner square in the eye. "I've never once said that." Gary laughed way too hard. His second jab came near the head table when Tara asked whether my pension covered home repairs. Gary answered before I could open my mouth. "She's used to making do. That's what happens when you spend your best years stuck in a supply hangar." I touched the sealed envelope inside my purse and said nothing. His third jab came straight from the stage, and that one had 400 witnesses. He painted my career as a failure, my injury as proof of it, and my single life as an empty gap he'd been forced to fill in. The laughter rippled across table 31. I pushed my chair back, not out of anger, not out of fear, because I was finished letting my son serve as his punchline. If you've ever sat frozen while someone you loved shrank your entire life down into a joke, tell me in the comments the one thing they never bothered asking you about. Sometimes the deepest wound isn't being despised. It's being judged without ever being known. Before I could rise fully, the MC stepped back up and introduced General Rourke. He walked to the podium with no prepared remarks, just a single index card. "I was asked to speak about service," he said. "Instead, I want to talk about a debt I owe." The room shifted its energy. He described the valley, the storm, the grounding order, the 11 men pinned down under enemy fire. Gary's smile started slipping by degrees. "1 aircraft went in anyway," the general said. "A medevac crew ran 2 separate lifts through a corridor no pilot should have survived. On the second departure, the aircraft took a hit and went down past the ridge." He paused. I could still hear that rotor beat, low and steady, close enough to feel it in my teeth. "The pilot lived," he went on. "Her hand never fully recovered. I put her in for the Distinguished Flying Cross. I spent 15 years searching for her and came up empty." He glanced down at his card. The call sign was Halo 6. A firefighter 3 tables up shot to his feet so fast his chair crashed to the floor. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking. He tried again. "Sir, Halo 6 is sitting in this room." Nobody stirred. The firefighter turned toward me. I recognized his eyes before I placed his face. Older now, sturdier, but still carrying that same terrified 19-year-old somewhere behind them. He walked past the head table, past Gary, past every donor in the room, and stopped directly in front of my ruined hand. "I held this hand," he said, "inside the aircraft, right before we went down. Marcus Bell. I was the youngest soldier from that mountain." He stared at my crooked fingers and started to tremble. "You told me to hold my altitude. I thought it was the strangest thing I'd ever heard anyone say. I've repeated it to myself every single day since." I stood up. The stage mic picked up all the tiny sounds filling the room. A glass clinking against a plate, a breath drawn too fast, fabric rustling as people turned to look. General Rourke snapped to attention. I gave him a single sentence. "Chief Warrant Officer 5, Margaret Sutton, Halo 6. He saluted. Not some quick ceremonial gesture, but a full, deliberate salute held across the entire length of the ballroom. He stepped down off the stage and walked toward table 31 without ever lowering his hand. The retired school teacher beside me stood first, then the firefighters, then every veteran in the building. Chairs scraped back in waves. Some people saluted, others simply rose to their feet. The general stopped in front of me. "Ma'am," he said, "I've spent 15 years looking for you." His hand shook slightly near his brow. "Thank you for my soldiers." Behind him, Gary stayed frozen beside the podium, jaw clenched, one hand gripping the edge of the stage. He looked smaller somehow, without anyone even laying a finger on him. Marcus reached into his dress jacket and pulled out a cheap postcard. Mountains printed on the front, blue ink scrawled across the back. 4th of March, still breathing, thank you, he read aloud. "I sent one every single year," he told me. "I never signed my name, though. I didn't know how to put my name under a life you'd given me." 15 unsigned postcards had been sitting in my kitchen drawer all along. 15 years I'd pictured a total stranger. He'd been living 3 miles from me the whole time, raising 2 kids and running into burning buildings as a Hartsville firefighter. That should have wrapped up the whole reveal. It didn't. My niece Emily hurried over from the head table, clutching my handbag, her face pale. "Aunt Maggie," she said, "the envelope." I'd completely forgotten about it. General Rourke spotted the Department of the Army seal and glanced at me for permission. I nodded once. He opened it with care. Inside was a copy of my medal citation, yellowed around the edges, along with a letter written in my mother's handwriting. The general read only the official citation out loud. "For extraordinary heroism during aerial flight, Chief Warrant Officer Margaret Sutton, call sign Halo 6, repeatedly flew into hostile fire to evacuate 11 wounded soldiers after all aviation assets had been ordered grounded." Gary let go of the stage edge. His hand wouldn't stop shaking. Tara stared down at the floor. Emily took the letter from the general and carried it over to me. Along the outside edge, my mother had added one more line. "Your father found this. He couldn't bring himself to hand it over. I couldn't let him destroy it either." The truth had been sitting inside his shed the entire time. Never accepted, never honored, just hidden away. That stung worse than anything Gary had said. It also set me free from it. I didn't confront my brother in that ballroom. I didn't march up onto the stage or grab the microphone. I'd wasted too many years believing vindication required a big speech. It doesn't. Sometimes the truth just needs a little breathing room. The gala wrapped up without ever finishing its official program. People drifted over to table 31 quietly. A Vietnam veteran touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. A nurse mentioned her son had flown medevac too. The young reporter closed his notebook and told me, "Ma'am, for the first time all night, I think we're finally honoring the right person." That line stuck with me longer than any of the applause did. Outside, freezing rain tapped against the hotel awning. I stood beneath it alone for several minutes, breathing in air that smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. Gary found me at the coat check, my coat draped over one arm. "I didn't know," he said, all the stage presence drained out of his voice. "Dad told us you washed out. He said you couldn't hack flying. Why'd you let me say all that?" I slipped my coat on. "The silence was mine to own," I told him. "The cruelty was yours." He just stared at me. I handed him one final truth. "You never asked," that was all I said. 8 months later, Gary's name came off the largest stone on the memorial. He requested the change himself. The plaque now lists every Hartsville resident who ever served, all names carved the same size. Mine is on there. So is my father's. Gary still owns his dealerships. He still shows up at civic dinners, but people say he sits off to the side now and slips out before the photographs. Tara stopped calling me with her kindness-shaped insults. Emily comes by every Sunday. My brother and I aren't close. We may never be. The last time he called, he didn't bring up his business or the memorial at all. He asked, "What did the flying actually feel like?" I gave him a partial answer. Some relationships get rebuilt one honest question at a time. Others just get quiet enough to stop hurting. I opened my